Is it working?
I think we're on.
We're on. This is Crossing Phase, the first podcast featuring a Christian and a Muslim talking religion and politics. My name is Matt Hawkins. I'm a former policy director for the Southern Baptist Convention, and my co-host is John Pinna, founder and director of Muslims for Muslims, a new organization that you'll continue to hear more about as we go. As always, you're available to listen to podcasts wherever you can find podcasts. And of course, we're here on YouTube if you'd like to see our faces. But a lot of people might see us and then go back to the audio edition, which we don't mind. Visit us on Twitter, on Facebook, and on Instagram. Crossing Phase are easy to find. John Pinna, how's upstate New York?
Upstate New York's not too bad. I mean, there might have been a little bit of fumbling in the beginning of this because this is the first time I've actually hit the record button. So Matthew's been responsible for testing my capabilities, and so
right.
Any kind of issues that happen are a Turkish flaw, as we know, as we're referencing previous
it's all
shows.
John's fault today.
It is all my fault. There's no doubt about it. But it's getting cooler up here. So it's we always talk about the weather, and the drama of the family is substantial and profound. So and we have a really interesting guest today. We have Mr. George Sorial. So and I'm very lucky and feel very it's very gracious of him to participate. We've spent the better part of maybe a year and a half, maybe 2 years now, interfacing with each other and working on a number of issues and initiatives with each other, all in the peripheral, nothing super major, but I've grown to think of George as an old friend and acquaintance for many reasons. His path in private industry all the way through to where he is now. He was the senior vice president of the Trump companies in various capacities, supported the president in his business career, is the author of The Real Deal, My Decade of Fighting Battles with and Winning Wars with Trump, and has transitioned from the business world into the government relations and international development world to help leverage his relationship with the president to defend vulnerable populations. He's a Coptic Christian, and I don't. Were you born in Egypt? Your father was from Egypt.
I was actually, John. First of all, thank you, John and Matthew, for having me here. I really appreciate it, and John, thank you for that warm welcome. That's very kind of you. But no, I was actually born, people always ask me that question, and it's a seemingly simple question. Where are you from? And I kind of snicker. I have 3 different passports. I was actually born in England. And shortly after my birth, I spent almost a year in Egypt, then went back to England and eventually immigrated to the United States when I was 2 years old. Like many of us, my parents had nothing. Granted, my father had an education, but he had nothing. And we left England by boat, came across the Atlantic, arrived in New York, and the rest is history. So to answer your question, John, I was actually born in Norwich, England.
Norwich, England. Well, I went to Norwich University, but this is from Vermont. And when I wear the sweatshirt, everybody always says Norwich, England, and I have to say, not that sophisticated, But we have these interesting stories. I think that I always wondered. I know your father was from Egypt, and I go, God, I'm gonna have to ask him. But we're very blessed to have you on. It's very meaningful for you to take the time. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about your story. I kind of look at you as sort of a brother because I left the very lucrative career in the construction industry. I had 2 clients, the National Association of Home Builders and the U.S. Department of Commerce. Spent 10 years in the boom years, 1999, 2009, and then left and then went into really advocacy work. And I always say, it was when we had all the money in the world, working for the largest industry in the country, $988 billion industry. We didn't care about, a process and laws and stuff. We were just doing whatever. But all that knowledge of legislation and process really mattered when you work for nonprofits. But maybe you could tell us about that journey, about how you started, and I think it was about 13 years with the Trump companies, and then transitioned into where you are now, and leveraging your personal and professional relationship with the president to help these populations.
Sure. I mean, I'll just be very candid. I mean, my life was definitely not scripted. I was raised like many immigrant families that everything was education, education, education. You know, the only thing I really knew about my father, again, he was a surgeon, and that was my path. All my cousins were doctors, all our friends were doctors. My father came to the United States with my mother in 1970 when the United States at the time was facing a crisis. There was a shortage of physicians, there was a shortage of surgeons. If my memory is correct, Congress created a special visa, and they actually came over to Europe and recruited my father and a group of his friends to come to the United States. They really never had any intentions of coming to the United States. They were very happy living in England. So my whole time in high school, I was going to be a doctor. When I ended up going to college, after the first year or two, I had this shocking revelation that I wasn't really very good at science. I wasn't really very interested in science. I was able to muddle my way through my freshman year, but when I was confronted with subjects like organic chemistry, I said to myself, you know, it's really time for me to think about doing something else. I was very into history and religion. I was a double major. I was a classics major, and also I picked up a psychology major as well. In retrospect, if I could do it again, I probably would have focused on something like theology. But I came out of college. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I took a couple of years off, and during the day for a year, I worked for a judge. And then at night, I worked for a hospital. I was a phlebotomist. I was also an EKG technician. So I did this for a couple of years. I also worked for a law firm. You know, after I spent a year working for a judge in Newark, New Jersey, I worked for a firm in Jersey City, and I still continued to work at the hospital. When I look back on it, I mean, they were really long days. I mean, I was 21, 22 years old, and, you know, I was leaving my house at, 7:45, not getting home, until midnight. But in that 2-year journey, I discovered that, look, I'll go to law school. I couldn't say that I really loved it, but it seemed like a logical progression. I was lucky that I had that option. My parents took great care of me. I ended up going to law school, JD MBA at Boston University. I came out like many people. I worked for the government. I was a county counsel. I did prosecution work in the area of violent sex crimes. I did a lot of work under Megan's Law. If you remember, that was 95, 96, where Megan's Law was really thriving, and states and municipalities were creating task force to basically take violent sex offenders who'd maxed out their prison sentences and put them in mental institutions. So it was kind of a challenging couple of years. I ended up, like many people that do that, just kind of getting tired of it. I moved on to a firm named Day Pitney, and then I ended up going to another law firm called the Cotis Fitzpatrick, and it was shortly after 9/11, so it was maybe the end of 2001, the beginning of 2002, that I was working on a real estate deal. We were actually representing a group of Wall Street investors that had grabbed John DeLorean's estate in Morris County, New Jersey, out of bankruptcy. And they were trying to build a golf course and a resort and some homes, and they weren't really doing very well. Along comes Trump, buys them out. So at the groundbreaking ceremony, I grew up in New York and, primarily northern Jersey. Trump was always a larger than life character. Anybody who grew up in that area, Trump was across the river doing all sorts of things. I mean,
we grew up with Trump. We were socialized, as New York.
I went and lost monies in his casinos. I mean, I was the kid that drove to Atlantic City on the weekend, and, as soon as I was old enough. But there he is, right in front of me. Now, I have an interesting background that my father is a Christian from Egypt, Coptic Orthodox, and my mother is actually Scottish. My mother is Scottish from a very small remote island on the northwest coast called the Isle of Lewis, born in a town called Stornoway. Well, guess whose mother was also born in Stornoway? President Trump.
The president.
So I walk up to him. He's helping himself to some shrimp. I mean, I'll really never forget this. And I walked up to him and I said, Mr. Trump, nice to meet you. I'm George Sorial. I was part of the legal team at Dakotas Fitzpatrick, blah, blah, blah. And I said, is it true that your mom was born in Stornoway? Now, remember, in those days, we didn't have, you couldn't go on Wikipedia. It wasn't that easy to get information. So he looked at me and he said, yeah, my mother's from Stornoway. What do you know about Stornoway? So I told him, well, that's where my mother was born. And I probably spent the first 25 years of my life spending my summers there. And that kind of struck up a very nice, warm conversation. During the course, he found that I was looking to buy an apartment in New York. And he gave me a number and he said, look, it was a Saturday morning. And he said, I want you to call this person, this number on Monday. And I want you in Trump World Tower, the tallest residential building in the world. I want you in that building. Now, John and Matthew, you've probably had these experiences in life where you bump into people at a meeting and they say to you, give me a call. I'll see if I can help you. And nothing ever comes out of it. But I called him Monday morning. And 2-3 days later, I was sitting in his office signing a contract to purchase a 2-bedroom apartment. So that really struck. I mean, that's a true story as it happened.
And the President Trump President Trump has introduced you to your wife, right?
He did. Yeah, I started to do some legal work for him here and there. He would invite me, out socially, and this went on for probably 3-4 years, and then 5 years. Around 2006, he called me into his office one day, and Don, Ivanka, and Eric were there, and he was very excited. He had floor plans out on his desk, and he said, I just bought 1,500 acres of land. Why don't you come and work for me? We're going to build a golf course in Scotland. This is going to be great. We're going to honor our mothers. It'll be fun. I said, look, the problem is, I was at the time a corporate lawyer. My background was really M&A. I told him, look, I've never even played golf. Where I grew up in New Jersey, a guy that had an Egyptian father was not going to really get into, it didn't really fit into any of the country clubs. It just was nothing that I grew up with. But I came on board, and John, you're right. I ended up meeting my wife there. And I worked in the company for many years. I was executive vice president and counsel. I did a fair amount of legal work, but my primary role there was in development, site acquisition. Then I would actually oversee the entire planning process. And once we gained permits and approvals, I would hire the development team and actually oversee construction as well. So I wore many hats at the organization. And again, my wife worked very closely. My wife was his assistant. So I met her there. And when he became president, I got pulled back really into a more legal function again. And this kind of leads into how I got to where I am now. But I was made the first chief compliance counsel to the Trump organization. And I worked with a really skilled team to put together the series of trusts that the company's operating under now and implement a global compliance program. And I was really the guy initially that handled many of the inquiries from Congress on emoluments, conflicts of interests, some of the investigations you've read about, until I came out of the company about 1.5 years ago when my book was published. And I continue to be very involved with him on many levels, many different projects in the White House. I remain very close to him. Really, what I always say is, aside from my own mother and father, nobody has done more for me in life than President Trump.
You have a very different view than what the media talks about and so forth. And my interaction with you and really the administration over those last 3 years has been very different as well, because I've collaborated on a number of issues and agenda items and criminal justice and international religious freedom and so forth. So, I think your story is compelling. Who you are and where you come from is as a result of the president's in his private life and professional life working with you. But maybe can you give us a funny anecdote? Can you give us something? Like what's your Trump moment? You know what I mean? Where he was, that's something that's a little bit, something that we don't know that's sexy. That would be funny or goofy.
I don't know if it's sexy, but it was a really touching moment. I mean, over the years we traveled a lot. I was always talking to him about my experiences in the Middle East, and I think he was kind of on some level fascinated by the stories I told him about the Coptic church and the things that I'd seen and done, because I did spend a lot of time in Egypt. My parents were really adamant about keeping myself and my sister close to our respective families. So every year we would spend 4 to 5 weeks around Christmas time in Egypt, in Cairo, and then I would spend my summers in Europe, in Scotland. But something that he did that really touched me when he was elected, and I don't think I'm being disingenuous. I mean, it wasn't exactly something that people in the company thought would happen. I had confidence in him. I knew that he was certainly qualified, but in my heart of hearts, and I was honest with him when I was asked the question, am I going to get elected? I'd say, look, I think it's a long shot. I would consistently give the answer, if you're going to run from your office in Fifth Avenue, I don't see it happen. If you're going to get out on the road and campaign, I think you'll do it. Yeah. That's what he did. So when he was elected, there was a real, just beyond, the first 3 or 4 days, there was complete euphoria. Everybody was kind of pinching themselves. Like, did this happen? Yes, it happens. I mean, I remember having a call with the president Wednesday morning after the election. I reached him at about 9:30. I was down in Florida working on some election fraud issues. But I said to him, I guess I have to call you president now for the rest of your life. I mean, it was unbelievable. But the following week, everybody was summoned to New York. And we were all, my office was on the 26th floor of Trump Tower, right down the hall from his office. And there was such excitement going on. There was so much activity. There were so many people there. I mean, it was literally a fascinating thing to have an inside view to. A government was being formed. But amidst all this chaos, he called me to his office and he said, George, I want you to reach out to your Pope. I said, okay, I'm happy to do that. He said, I want you to tell him, I know that there's been a lot of problems with killings and discrimination against Christians in Egypt. And I want you to tell your Pope that things are going to be different for you now. Things are going to be different for everybody now. I'm going to be watching. And I ended up facilitating a fascinating dialogue. I mean, if you think about it, the Coptic Orthodox Pope, Pope Tawadros, and Donald Trump, probably, I don't know if you could find 2 people that are more different on every level, but they struck up a friendship. And there was a whole series of letters going back and forth. And I'm still optimistic that at some point there's an open invitation for him to come to the White House. I think that'll happen. But I was really touched by that. And I think, I don't know, John, if that's something sexy, but I think it's something that when I tell that story, people are, fascinated that amidst all that, it gives you a little insight into his heart. And it gives you, a side of him that we may not often see in his tweets or his television appearances. He's a very, very different person than I think he's portrayed by the mainstream media.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate this story. International religious freedom is something that's the cornerstone of this administration and enshrined in the NSS. And I spent some time helping draft the words that go in the NSS, but it's a priority, the national security strategy. So I appreciate you telling the story, because you have a insight and a window into the person, which is very different than what everyone else sees. And especially me, even though I interact with this administration, I've only flown in a few times and shook a hand, did this and that with the president a few times, but nothing that is really allowed me to get to know the man other than the New York view of him. So I appreciate you taking the time to share that with us.
No, it's my pleasure. But I mean,
George,
go ahead, Matthew. Sorry.
okay, that's all right. I was going to say I'd like to learn more about your experience growing up in the Coptic faith. Sounds pretty unique given that you grew up stateside and in Europe, and yet seem to have a real connection to the Coptic church in Egypt. And so just curious if you want to share a little bit more about what that was like growing up. And for listeners who might not be familiar with the Coptic church, maybe kind of the broad strokes about what sets it apart or kind of what makes it unique within the rest of Christianity.
Sure. Well, our church was founded in the first century by St. Mark, one of the authors of the Gospels. And we have an uninterrupted line of popes since St. Mark. I believe now Pope Tawadros is our 118th pope. I might be off by a year or two, but that sounds right. We're an Eastern Orthodox church. And, I think people always ask me, I mean, when you grow up with something, you sort of take it for granted. It's all you know. And,
Right.
It had a very powerful impact on me, I think most specifically in the area of faith. And I think like many immigrant families, it wasn't really until I went to college that I even spent time with people outside of my community. Obviously, there were some exceptions, people that lived, across the street from me, but pretty much when I grew up, I spent all my time. Our community is completely centered around the church. The church was the center of all life, of all activity. Your friends all went to the same church. Your entire being rotated around the church, with the priest being, your father, your spiritual advisor. But I think at a very young age, and I should actually take a few steps back. My mother was Scottish, and my mother was raised as a Presbyterian. But when she met my father, she, I wouldn't say converted, but she was baptized Coptic, learned to speak Arabic. It's funny, my mother is fluent in English, Gaelic, and Arabic.
Wow.
And, spent a fair amount of time in Egypt. So we were completely raised in the Coptic church. But I think what the church did for me was give me an unshakable faith. I don't know exactly how, and it's a subject that I reflect on. How did I get this faith? Did I see anything physical and tangible? Maybe perhaps I didn't see, Christ or Saint Mary, but I just was raised in an environment of trust and faith. And I knew nothing else. And it gave me an unshakable foundation, even during, difficult years, teenage years. I always consider myself an American, and I love America. And it's something that my father would say to me all the time. You're lucky. America is the envy of the world. You're lucky you're here. And actually, to digress for a second, one of the things I lament about most today with everything that's going on is that people seem to have rejected that. Okay, there's a lot of things going on that I don't agree with, but what really bothers me the most is people here, especially in the context of what we're talking about, religious freedom, people take that privilege for granted. Okay, and I grew up watching a society where that really wasn't the case. Now, again, I think we can talk a little bit, how did we get there? I don't know. I've had these discussions with John before. My father's 85 years old. My father will be the first to tell you, when he was a kid growing up in Cairo, there was no Muslims, there was no Jews, there was no Christians. I mean, I'm being facetious, of course there were, but everybody was together. There was no tension, there was no harmony. People would celebrate religious holidays with each other without hesitation and embrace the joy. So I don't know how we got to this part, but again, I don't mean to be all over the place, but growing up and seeing what my family was dealing with in Cairo, also gave me a profound sense of, wow, these people are growing up in a tough environment of discrimination, terrorism, and killing, and they still keep their faith. And it had a really deep impact on me, but it made me a very strong person. And I still carry that with me today, despite any challenge that I face. It's my faith and my belief in there are more important things coming in my future that give me the ability to face the challenges and really not worry. And I'm trying very hard now to instill those principles. I think as you move forward through generations, it starts to get harder and harder to keep these traditions. So it's something that I'm wrestling with now.
Yeah. And is your background with the Coptic Church, is that something that contributed to your current passion for engaging international development and in human rights, or where did that passion come from?
I was very involved with my church. I was an ordained deacon at a young age, so I served on the altar for many years, and I learned a lot about our Mass and the hymns and the history of our church. I mean, it was something that it wasn't forced upon me. I saw it and I was convinced and I embraced it. Obviously, like many kids, you go through, your teenage years where, you may stray, but I came back to it. It's very strong and living within me now. So I think, yes, I mean, maybe getting to, how did I end up in this situation? I've been lucky. God's been good to me in life. I've had a very interesting life. I've done a lot of good things. I've done fairly well. And when I came out of the organization, and, again, Matthew and John, I never expected any of this. Okay. I lived a fairly simple life growing up. My father worked hard and he did well, and we were provided for, but I didn't contemplate the magnitude of what was going to happen to me. I never really expected to be involved with a person like Trump. And actually, funnily enough, when I was thinking about going to work for him, I was having a discussion with a priest that I was very close to, who said, look, I think you should take the job and I think you should work with him. And one day he's going to ask you, how did you get this way? How are you so honest and straightforward? And, how did you succeed? And you're going to tell him it's because of my faith. And that actually ended up happening. But when I came out of the organization, I mean, really the genesis of that was, I was in the Oval Office one day and I was having a conversation with him, and he was very upset about people coming in, meeting him for 10 minutes, going out and writing a book. And I said to him, look, let me write a book. I'd like to write a book, just a reflection on the things I've done with you. I wasn't really sure that anybody would find that interesting, but I was able to get a contract with HarperCollins, published a book. I just have a copy of it right here. Book came out last year. It was June 2019. And, if I'm being honest, at that point, I'd already spent quite an amount of time wrangling with the Senate and the House. You'll remember with the 2018 elections, the Democrats took the House. My life was very difficult. I was constantly hit with letters, subpoenas. It just really wasn't what I signed up for. And I actually thought we weren't really doing much development as a company. So I had a big sit down with Don, Eric, and the president, and we all decided, look, I'm going to leave the company. I'm still going to support the campaign, which I do. I'm a surrogate. I also raise money for them. I'm a fundraiser. But I was going to come out, do my own thing. And one of the things that I felt very passionately about was, look, I'm in a unique position right now. I have a good relationship, not just with the president, but with many people in the administration. And I find myself, not by design, but just by circumstance, this man that I worked with out of nowhere became president. And I said, this is going to be a great opportunity for me to really do something that I was passionate about. And really one of my passions, and I think it is a growth of my faith, and not only my faith, but my experience, was religious freedom. I never took it for granted. The comments that I made earlier about this younger generation taking these things for granted, something that I really, it hurts me. It makes me, stay up at night. So I sort of stumbled into this position, and I said to myself, look, I still need to make a living, but I can devote now a chunk of my time to working in an area to promote religious freedom, not just for Christians, not just for cops, but for everybody. And, look, we all disagree. I probably disagree with some things that you believe in, Matthew. I certainly disagree with some things that John probably, holds, true, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. It's okay for us to disagree. That's what makes life interesting. We have to respect each other, and we have to live with each other. And as I mentioned when we were kind of chatting before we began this podcast, that's what I really want. I'm trying to figure out a way now where I can really devote most of my time towards fighting for these issues, fighting for the oppressed, using the access and the voice I have for whatever, even if it's this just tiny, small. If I can make a little bit of an impact, it's worth it.
With the Coptic Christian Church, dignity of the human person is really important, and it's a major thread in your faith as it is mine. We're cousins. The Coptic Christians and the Ismaili community
Right.
in Egypt. It's almost very seamlessly. And
Nobody lets us.
Yeah, it's the people that they don't know if we're collaborating or what, but when I was working with the American Islamic Congress, we were defending the Coptic Christians very passionately, and we started this international religious freedom agenda 10 years ago, when no one thought, number one, it would be enshrined in the national security strategy and all these different things. Now everybody's jumped on board, but those were difficult years, even within my own community, when I was advocating for international religious freedom, and they were saying, oh, you want to know what we can, that's something that's for the NGOs to do. And as American Muslims were focusing on other areas. Now it's commonplace. Now there's a tremendous community working on international religious freedom. But your transition is profound, because from business, guiding principles, ethics, and rules from your Coptic background. When I speak to you, and part of the reason why you and I have a relationship is you are always talking about not just your faith community, but you're talking about global community of vulnerable populations. So maybe you could touch upon some of the elements that you've talked about with the president, and how it's transitioned into actually real world tangible results. I know we have a National Coptic Day, right? That's something that was a profound moment. But how are those conversations go? And how does the president receive them? And what is actually where's that led to?
Well, he always gives me the time, and I'm glad you mentioned the National Coptic Day. The genesis of that was a very close friend of mine, another Copt who lives in Florida, Nader Anis. He's also another lawyer. And I just helped facilitate and made the introduction to the White House. And, it was very good of the president to do that. But I think one thing that you have to give the president a lot of credit for is that for the first time, he's really brought these issues of religious freedom and religious oppression to the table and made them a part of his agenda. And I think we cannot underestimate the enormity of what we're all doing right now, because I think in addition to, there are parts of the world where Muslims are under attack, there's parts of the world where Christians are under attack, there's parts of the world where Jews are under attack. But what I think is really going on here is there's actually an even broader force that's really anti-God, that's anti-religion. And if we want to be honest and call it what it is, it's really evil. There's the battle between good and evil. Now, to me, it doesn't matter, okay, whether you're born a Muslim or a Jew or a Christian, okay? A person of God is a person of God. And I think there's really an importance now for all faiths. Okay, and I think when you use that term faith, it's implicit that you're referring to a deity, a God. All people of faith need to get together and try to fight this force, these forces of evil. And I think you can see a lot of what's going on in the United States. It's being held up, and people are masquerading for some seemingly good causes. But when you really dig behind the surface a little bit, a lot of it is really anti-God. A lot of it is evil. And I think this administration has really fought those issues and brought them to the forefront. I've spent a lot of time having discussions about these types of matters with the president. And I've worked with, I haven't had a lot of interaction with the vice president, but I've had a lot of interaction with members of his team. And it's okay to sit in the White House with government people and have these discussions and try to figure out what to do about them. I think in past administrations, it's almost seen as you can't talk about God. You can't talk about faith. Somehow that's a violation of, the separation of church and state, which I don't really believe, that's the case.
Well, when you have people of faith, that are working globally, and faith is a driver in conflict, faith is a driver in humanitarian work. To ignore the component and I know this is an argument that Matthew's tribe echoes as well. It doesn't make any sense to not include that. I mean, cultural competency is important. Religious competency is important. As somebody who built a career in engagement modeling of collective cultures in an Islamic context, it's like, hello, in order to talk to these people, you need to know about their faith backgrounds and what drives them. And it can stem off conflict as well.
Well, that's it. You just hit the nail on the head, John. I mean, we have to know each other, in a more intimate way. And what I mean by that is we have to understand how our families work. We need to sit and break bread with each other. How do we eat? How do we think? How do we celebrate our holidays? And what I see in my life, and it was funny, I was in Washington over the weekend, and I had to go to the White House. I had my son with me, and afterwards, I actually ended up taking him to the Museum of the Bible, and large African-American gentleman wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt picked me up. So we just started to chat. And I said, look, I mean, do you really, do you understand what's going on with that movement? And I said, look, I don't believe, and I say this with all my heart, okay? I think you have fringe elements on either side that have their own agendas. And I don't think, certainly none of them are godly agendas. But I think 95% of the people, I don't care what your race or your ethnicity or your religion, look at the basic cores. What do you want in your life? Okay, if somebody says to me, George, what do you want in my life? I want peace. I want to be able to work and grow and take care of my family. I want to take care of my wife and my children. I want them to grow up in a harmonic environment. I want them to be educated. And I obviously want them to have better lives than I do. I think irrespective of who you are, that's the answer that everybody's going to give. We're not that different. So I think we need to spend time. We need to educate. We need to get to know each other, dispel the myths. And I am convinced that by doing so, that's how we're going to have peace and harmony, because that's really what, that's what we're all striving for.
Yeah, I appreciate your words on that, and appreciate your model of engaging a BLM activist. I spent a good deal of time with some friends left of center, even though I'm a right of center kind of guy, politically speaking, typically. And I think you're right to try to define, right, the fringe elements on either side of the aisle. And so once I'm able to kind of clear away the noise and define what we're actually talking about, I think your 2 points are well taken, that we need some communication and like you said, some education. And so I've been very grateful for some Black Christian friends who have been very patient with me to tell me of their experiences in America and their families' experiences. And it reminds me that we're not as distant from the civil rights movement era as we think we are, and our culture is not as distant from the effects and ramifications of slavery long term that sometimes we think we are. So I think you're right about there's an education piece and also a communication piece, and I think we need to be able to try to identify kind of good faith actors on both sides of the aisle who can kind of parse the noise and the extremities on either side, and then but still recognize that our nation has some challenges that we need to work through together. And so I think there's much to talk about and to continue in that front. And of course, I'm also fond of the Museum of the Bible. We've talked about that place here
Great place.
today. Yeah, it's a pretty remarkable place, highly endorsed. I do want to ask one more follow-up question.
Sure.
Given your experience twofold, both as an immigrant to the States and also someone that's been a part of the administration, and I don't want to ask you a gotcha question here, but given your perspective on the human rights angle and the persecuted people, what's your view of this administration's refugee and immigration policy writ large? We kind of see refugee intake dwindling to kind of record lows in recent years, at a peak of displaced people around the globe. Naturally, the United States is not can't be the only destination for refugees and can't solve it on its own. But some people in my group are troubled by the reduction of refugees. So I'm curious how you're thinking about those kinds of angles.
Yeah, it's a very, it's a difficult issue, Matthew. And just to clarify, actually, I was not part of the administration. I was part of the organization. I never worked for government. Just to be clear on that. But, look,
it's a good clarification. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really, really difficult issue. Okay, and I can give you two answers. Okay, and I myself, I think in my answers you're going to see the dichotomy that I struggle with. Okay, Speaking as a person of faith, okay, I understand why people are crossing the borders. I understand why my own family came here. And, not everything that the president says or does and the administration says or does do I agree with. So in my heart, I lament for, I think of my own, I look at my wife and my kids and I say to myself, okay, if I was a poor person in South America, I'm walking to that border. Okay, I'm doing it. I'm going over that river and I'm climbing the fence. I'm going to try to give them a better life. So I certainly understand the mindset, and I think that represents the overwhelming, look, there are some bad actors that are coming for different reasons, but I would probably think that's, a smaller percentage. So I struggle with that. I understand it. I lament and I pray for them. And my heart really bleeds. And as an immigrant, I understand that. Okay. And I look around that, not just in my community, but in many immigrant communities, these are some of the most grateful, patriotic, productive people in the United States because they have perspective. Immigrants have perspectives. They came from countries where they don't enjoy these freedoms. Okay. And they see their families continuing to suffer. So that's one answer. Okay. But what I wrestle with is practical issues. Okay. The United States can't be, and again, I'm just putting the issues out there. I'm not necessarily saying that they're, my views, but practical arguments. Okay. We can't take every single person that wants to come into the country. There has certainly, at minimum, needs to be a process. There needs to be laws. These laws need to be observed. We do need to maintain borders. We need to be careful about who we allow to enter this country. It took my family 7 years. Okay, 7 years. And in our instance, as I mentioned, my father was recruited here. We still didn't become citizens for 7 years. And I can remember being a little kid standing in a federal courtroom taking the oath. So I think there has to be a recognition of the realities of both. Okay, it's not realistic to say we're just going to let every person in here. We just can't. Sure. But at the same time, part of our mission as Americans is to be merciful and welcome immigrants, and we need to continue to do that. And we need to continue to embrace the oppressed. So you can see in my answer, and I think in the sincerity of what I said on both sides of the aisle, there has to be some middle balance. Now, I don't purport to have an answer, but what I see politically is people arguing one way or the other. And I don't think that's the right approach. And what we have now is, a system that, needs improvement.
Yeah, I appreciate your candid answer on that. And I think we can hear your heart in your answer. So I appreciate you fielding that question.
No problem.
Yeah, and, we're running up against the clock. I know that we're almost at 12, and I wanted to say that I appreciate you taking the time and mentioning that at the end there, that the dichotomy. We always deal with these administrations, regardless of our personal relationships, and there's some policies that are out there. It might be the least worst choice, right? And I dealt with that with administrations all the way through. So there's policies with the current administration that I wrestle with, and I get a lot of heat for dealing with them, for interacting with the administration, but you gotta be in it and forward your opinion. Otherwise, it's not if you're not there, not at the table, they're not going to get an alternate view of what's going on. So I appreciate you sharing that duality, because it's something that I deal with, Matt's dealt with, and you deal with as well.
Yeah, and it is. I mean, we're told every day that things are black and white, and things are absolute, and that's really not the case. Resolution of some of these issues are not so black and white. They're complex, but they need dialogue. They need understanding. And again, I try to raise my kids are still young. I don't think they understand or see any of this. Everybody's our brother. I have Sunni brothers, I have Shiite brothers, I have Coptic brothers, I have Protestant brothers, I have Catholic brothers. I think we need to embrace that. We can disagree on certain things, even things that are pivotal in our life about our faith. We can disagree. That's okay, but we can love each other. We can get along with each other. And certainly, our religion tells us to embrace people that are different. I think we all were raised with those principles, and I think we need to fight to remind people of their moral obligations in that regard.
I guess appreciate that your time and thoughtfulness in kind of dancing with us with some of these questions. It means a lot for you to take time out of your schedule, and very gracious of you to participate. Matthew, want to lead us out?
Sure. Well, George Sorial, thank you for visiting with us on Crossing Faiths. If folks want to catch your book or otherwise learn more about your organizations and your nonprofit, where can folks find you?
It's available everywhere. And thank you, Matthew, again. And thank you, John. It's available on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, any bookstore, Audible. I'll hold up a copy of it again if anybody's interested in buying it. I tried very hard to avoid some of the political acrimony, although I unavoidably delve into it somewhat, but it's really a compilation of short, simple stories that will give you a different perspective and some insight into a very complicated man.
George Sorial, thank you for being a guest on Crossing Faiths. Links to his information and more are available at crossingfaiths.com, and we're available anywhere you can listen to podcasts.
Thank you both.
Thank you.